Thanks, David. What's the topic?
I have it on my iPod.
That's fascinating. You actually just read it out to me. This is weird. Okay, which one is it? Remove tax exemptions. Just
I'm about to show you his iPhone.
Okay, thanks everyone. Welcome to round 4 of ASDC. The topic, as you all just heard, is that we should remove tax exemptions from religious institutions. And without any further ado, I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister.
Churches have an undue amount of influence and wealth in this society. This power gives them, this power then that they have is extremely dangerous, especially given that they have the agenda of a non-neutral party. We need to increase the access of welfare to all people and make sure it is non-discriminatory, but also handled by a party that is only driven by the well-being of their society, not by the religious affiliation of them. The first thing I'll do in my speech is provide a mechanism. Firstly, we remove all tax exemptions from the church and funnel back the funds, a lot of the funds that we get, back to the state in order to carry out more social goods in a more efficient manner, one regulated by the government itself. This means increased welfare, increased education, and healthcare. The main reason why we'd rather outsource this ability from the church to a party that already administers these benefits is we think it increase the power the state has in making sure that these benefits are more accessible. But the church is no saint, given what they preach. The church has selective charity because they discriminate minorities, but we also think that the church has an undue amount of influence on the people that are forced to opt into their model because the state does not have one that's equally as powerful. We change that standard. When do we award tax exemptions? The first question I'll ask. The 501c3 of tax exemptions provides 2 main criteria in giving these out. 1, a large ability to create a contribution. This means you need to be able to make a public good, but also ensure that there's an equal access of all people to that public good. But 2, that the motivation is unconditional and non-discriminatory. An example of this is we think charity organizations are unconditional. Unconditional in the sense they're not tied down to any specific goal, but 2, corporations reduce carbon emissions to make sure that this public good is accessible to all. The second principle I'll draw on this question. If someone uses charity for money laundering, but still gives back some benefit, we think we remove the tax exemption because even if you can provide to us some benefit, the overwhelming harm that is proposed by your side makes it harder for this benefit to really disseminate into the public in an essence that everyone can produce something from that. That's what the church does, and here's why it's particularly pernicious. Why don't churches deserve tax exemptions? The first reason why. We think a church makes aid conditional. As I said before, a church has too much influence given they have the backing of religion, but they're also driven by their own motive to get more people to be religious followers of Christianity, but to also spread the word of God. Therefore, your church charity targets people who are vulnerable, but more importantly, individuals who are minorities and have a history of being denied other opportunities. How do you then manipulate them? We think you manipulate them because you implicitly subject them to proselytization in a community that is based upon your Bible, that's based upon religious principles and values. And if these people are poor, they cannot opt out of that system. Compared to if the state had more money, we could give them a better, more neutral form of welfare. But another reason why the church manipulates them, no thank you, is that you make these individuals dependent on the church. And the reason why this is more harmful compared to the state is, if the church is non-neutral, then you make these people dependent on an organization that is not willing to help you unless you're willing to accept their words of God as well, or at least in some form of idea, align your beliefs. But thirdly, you force them into a community which makes it hard for them to opt out of. If it's a Christian community, if it's a Muslim community, a Hindu community, once you're in there, the ability for you to simply say, no, I don't want your help anymore, is extremely hard if the entire society is made up of a specific religion. It makes it a lot harder for them to assimilate back into society, even if they can make some use of these funds. But the second reason why churches do not deserve tax exemptions, you make tax exemptions or charity very selective. Churches discriminate specific minorities. And when I say discriminate, I don't mean to belittle it. I mean discriminate. And here's why. You discriminate pregnant women who choose to get an abortion because you think abortions are ungodly. You discriminate gay people because you think two individuals getting married of the same sex is ungodly. But most importantly, you discriminate women as a whole who want to be progressive, women as a whole who want to have a high standing of men. Therefore, if a church has an excess of power and wealth, you make the church the only viable option for welfare of these poor individuals. Therefore, you reduce access of these minorities to your welfare groups. If it's a church that chooses to discriminate on these beliefs, then more gay people or more women who want to be progressive cannot opt into it because one, they're afraid of what the church would do to them simply because they don't align their beliefs, or because the church chooses not to give aid to them. But two, we think you reduce the protection. So you subject these people who have completely different beliefs to a church that is conservative, to a church that is backwards, and they have no other option there. So we cannot protect them from this form of discrimination and imposition of values. But three, the influence that you have. So if you have a lot more people opting into this church, and you tell these people that women shouldn't be progressive, you tell these people that gays shouldn't get married, then it's more likely it's the monkey see, monkey do effect. These people then leave your charities and believe that idea. They believe the idea that gays shouldn't get married. They believe the idea that women shouldn't be progressive because that's what my saviors taught me in this church itself. And the influence you have is even worse if these are vulnerable minorities who are subject to more influence. But thirdly, no, thank you. Actually, yeah.
Sir, when it comes to making things such as selectively helping out people, non-government organizations are tax exempt as well.
So we think that non-government organizations that aren't affiliated with the church or any other religion makes charity or aid unconditional. Therefore, they're not driven by the motive of proselytizing you or making sure you spread the word of God or even know about it. So they just want you to be better off. Third reason why churches don't deserve tax exemptions is churches have too much power currently. So what you do in team opposition is you fund the legitimacy and credence of what they're doing. Therefore, you restrict the ability for other public goods to come up. Even though we recognize that charity is a public good, we also think that gay marriage is a public good. We also think women having access to education is a public good. Therefore, we want to increase the legitimacy that these other public goods could have by making sure more people opt towards a side that does not actively discriminate them. We'd also want a more secular state that is more powerful than the church in order to make sure these values have more impact. But finally, why is it better to provide more funds to the state? We think for three key reasons. One, the state is neutral. Two, the state provides access to all people and does not discriminate you. We open up our doors to everyone. But three, the state has more legitimacy in the sorts of ideas that we want to push out there, in the sort of aid that we want to provide.
Okay, let's thank the Prime Minister and the opposition leader. Here we go.
it's a shame that the affirmative side undermined all of the benefits that we can accrue from these social institutions. Because, for instance, in the Philippines, 70% of the poor is actually fed by the church. And in most cases, after calamities, the Catholic Church or even Islam is the one that counsels these people first. We think that these are only services that can be provided by religious institutions, and we shouldn't stop them from having capacity to do this. So our counter proposal is merely maintaining status quo where we still give these institutions tax exemption. 2 points of rebuttal. First, that the church is discriminatory and its aid is conditional. The first thing that we want to say is this isn't true at all. In places like Africa or even the Philippines, they don't really care if you're Catholic or not. They just provide you food and they provide you typhoon aid or whatever without even asking whether or not you're a Catholic or not. But secondly, even if this is the case, we don't think that's the point, right? Because in status quo, institutions are already allowed to choose who they want to help based on their preferences and based on their beliefs. For example, even many charities require people to follow certain rules, to follow social programs before these charities give funds to these individuals. No, thank you. So this isn't a legitimate standard to take away tax exemption when that extra money that Catholic churches or the Islam religion receives helps them far more than what they want to save. But the second thing that we want to respond to is the idea that these churches become so influential that they discriminate people and force them to believe in certain things. We think that, one, there is no concrete link between removing tax exemption and stopping these religious churches from not influencing people anymore, right? Because if the church is really against contraceptives, for example, they're going to continue going against this anyway. What's the link? No, thank you. But secondly, we think that we want to present the idea of alternatives. If you're a sick person and you don't believe in what the Catholic Church believes in, then just go to another charity which will also help you out anyway. That's the point. So let's go to the two arguments then. The first thing I want to discuss is why religious institutions forward social goods that only they can provide and that we must protect as much as possible. Because as they said, we already give tax exemptions to institutions that provide a lot of social goods, like charities, like NGOs, and even schools in a lot of countries. And the same logic here applies to churches. And the first thing that we want to say is that the benefit that churches give to other people is more than what they think it is. We already gave you the example of 70% of the poor being fed, right? You're removing that capacity of these churches to do so. And that's very problematic, right? Because the first thing that we say is in a lot of cases, it is even the church or these religious institutions who have more motivation to help these individuals rather than the state itself. So you can't rely on reallocating all of that funds to the state and are relying on it to just help everyone else. But the second thing that we want to say is that church, more often than not, has reaches that are far greater than the government. There are many places in rural areas where the state might not be present, but churches are present in these places, and you have to give them the money to provide for people in these societies as well. But the third thing that we want to say is that the religion is not only beneficial when it comes to financial things like food or money, but it also gives spiritual well-being. For instance, the state simply cannot provide. And what is the urgency of tax exemptions? This isn't as cheap as you think. Going out in places, preaching, counseling people, helping them pray isn't as cheap as they say. And we think the tax exemptions help them, for example, send missionary people to far-off provinces, fund their well-being there, and allow them to create well-being in those societies as well. These are mutually exclusive benefits on our side that are going to be lost when you remove the ability of churches to do this. Because if you remove that tax exemption, you're going to lose a lot of funding, making the church cost cut, and eventually sacrifice all of these benefits. No, thank you. But here's the second argument. I want to prove to you that their policy actually violates religious freedom. And this is where we look at how taxation works. When you tax people and acquire their money, you generally channel their money to state services and state purchases. It's something that's distributed universally and widely. Why is that a problem? because sometimes states have investments and have purchases that religions are extremely against. For instance, states fund wars, states fund militarization, even if that's something the church is extremely against. Or in many countries also, they fund things like contraception, even if the state is something that's very against it. Currently, we have separation of church and state, and we have tax exemption so that institutions aren't forced to pay for these things any longer. Their problem is that now the Catholic Church is going to be forced to pay for contraception or to pay for militarization because you're getting Catholic Church money and channeling them into these areas. This is a blatant violation of their belief system that we simply cannot accept. But before I go on.
Yeah, so states have very core principles that are mutual and beneficial to everyone, which are unconditional. What you have failed to do in your past 6 minutes is tell us why the state is okay in being complicit in the furthering of those harms and making gay marriage even more harder to achieve in these kinds of states.
The first thing that we say is that if you want to stop all of these harms, you can do that separately from the churches as well. You can provide gay marriage in the US without necessarily forcing the Catholic Church to pay for those gay marriages. So the main conclusion of this argument is simple. There is a distinction between taxing an individual and paying for militarization, for example, and taxing an entire institution and taxing an institutional belief, right? Because when the label is the church is funding wars and the church is funding militarization, that is the harm that's simply violating, and we simply cannot accept in Western liberal democracies that try to accumulate and try to accept as many beliefs as possible. The ultimate conclusion then of negative is this. One, we think that churches give far more benefits than harms. And despite whatever discrimination they want to push, in general, their benefits are so great that we simply cannot make them incapable of doing these things. But moreover, taxing is more complicated than they think it is. And we cannot force these institutions to pay for things that they simply do not believe in. This motion must fall. Thank you.
If 70% of the people in the Philippines subscribe to a church-run welfare, that is 70% of your population that subjects themselves to an environment to which they cannot opt out to an environment to which they are fed more than just welfare. They are fed ideologies that they cannot counter. It is not enough for them to say that people can just take resources and leave that system. When your environment that you subject yourself to changes, when you receive welfare from a person that tells you that you shouldn't be a prostitute, that tells you that abortion is wrong, when you place them in a higher level of superiority, individuals can't opt out of this system. The same way we are against proselytization because people are in a vulnerable state. When they cannot make a decision, we should subject and we should minimize this harm as well. So 2 questions. Is it fair to award churches this tax exemptions? And secondly, do we violate religious freedom? I'll integrate all my responses within these issues. 1, is it fair to award churches tax exemptions? The first thing that they tell us is that churches, like religious organizations and like non-governmental organizations, are also selective. But there is a difference. When NGOs subject themselves to charity, they are selective in picking a sector to which they help. That means when you pay for cancer, you don't choose specific sectors within cancer that you fund, in compared to a church-run welfare which caters to everyone and discriminates minorities that don't subject themselves to a system. So stop trying to be convenient. People don't have to pay for cancer and everything, but when they choose to fund a charity, they cannot be discriminatory to the cause that they try to push forward. But secondly, they say we don't minimize the harm. We think we do. Even if you have core tenets that are against abortion, even if you have core tenets that are against homosexual marriage, we limit your ability to indoctrinate them within individuals that are vulnerable. We limit your ability to place those ideologies within the minds of people that need money and within the minds of people that need food. We reduce the ability for churches to use that undue influence. Then they said there are alternatives. If you don't like a if you don't like a church ideology, go to state welfare. How can we do that when the characterization of your speech is that churches run welfare systems in the states, when churches operate the best welfare system that can be provided, because the state is not an alternative. We provide those reforms. We make it more accessible that the state can allocate these resources by taking tax money away from churches. We create an alternative. You don't. Your characterization fell upon you. Secondly, they say that churches have a deeper reach when it comes to rural areas or specific sectors. All the more the harm. You form an asymmetry of information when it comes to rural areas. When they're deprived of access to state principles and state ideologies, and to worse extent, education, the only thing that they live, sleep, and eat is church. The ideologies they are fed is based upon a church that supports them. And that is inherent manipulation. When the church already goes into deeper areas, the state has no incentive to go into these areas. The state allows an asymmetry of information within these areas. When we reduce the ability of churches to go into these places, only then will states go into these places. Only then can we debunk the asymmetry of information that makes it harder for us to accept gay marriage, because the only influence that a person gets in a rural area is a church. The only information that they get is homosexuality is wrong, abortion is wrong, and there's no state institution to tell them otherwise. Defend yourself.
Sir, why will the Catholic Church, why will the religion of Islam change their entire dogma just because?
Wait, can you repeat yourself? I couldn't. Can you repeat yourself?
Why will the Catholic Church, why will the religion of Islam change their dogma, which for centuries, just because they're paying taxes?
They are not going to change their dogma. We just don't want that principle to flow within the minds of people that are vulnerable. We are against proselytization in jails because criminals are vulnerable. We don't want them to buy into a religion in a vulnerable state. That is the same principle under this paradigm. We are not forcing religions to change. We are making progression easier by taking that reach out into the people. Second question, do we violate religious freedom? This is when we thought a lot of the portion of the material that came from the leader of opposition was redundant, because he said that when individuals pay for taxes should only be redirected to purposes that are in line with their core principles. That is a lie. Individuals who are against contraception in status quo do pay for your contraception through their taxes. Individuals who are religious do pay for abortive rights, and when states do subsidize it under those circumstances. Individuals who are against smoking do pay for lung cancer operations through the redirection of taxes. So taxes are unconditional, and if we can apply it to individuals on the ground, why can't we do it to religious organizations? Where we are unconditional in the division of taxes in terms of helping people on the ground, where we can violate a person's religious freedom for his own core tenets, why can't we do it to a religious organization? So the principle already applies. As a religious man, as an average reasonable person, you pay for contraception. You pay for abortion rights for people who can't afford it. Why can't we extend that to religious organizations who choose to violate that freedom? But the comparison is much better, because we think a state-operated system is a more neutral operated system. The problem with the accusation that they made about the state having less of an ability to help individuals, we think, yes, taxes is not as easy as it sounds, but with putting more money into taxes, it means better allocation for all sectors. It means better allocation for welfare, education, and healthcare. At the end of the day, it's a benefit for most sectors, better under your paradigm. So my argument, how do we think a state-operated system that is unconditional is better? We need to forward progression, and we need to reduce the outcomes or reduce the mediums that churches have in terms of indoctrinating individuals on the ground. Churches use welfare as an avenue to indoctrinate individuals into limiting the ability for us to progress. Side opposition says that this is not true. We can liberalize by avoiding the church, and we can liberalize by not taking away religious freedom. We can't do that. When churches use the money that they have from tax exemptions to not only fund soup kitchens, but also to lobby, but also to stifle abortions, and also to stifle rights for homosexuals, the tax exemption is not for a singular purpose. It gives them the unilateral power to stifle out other rights. It gives them more money and cash in overflows to limit the ability to carry other rights. So doing a public good does not cleanse you of the public goods that you have violated to the rest of society. We can't just take into consideration the benefits you give in a short term. We need to take into consideration the harms that you give towards individuals. We need to block out the ability for churches to brainwash individuals. We need to block out the ability for churches to give a singular perception towards individuals on the ground. We already violate religious freedom to individuals. Why can't we do that to a church that harms people who are vulnerable?
Okay. Let's thank the Deputy Prime Minister and welcome the Deputy Opposition Leader. Thank you.
There's only one fundamental premise that they're all sharing. It's the assumption, or it's the belief, that all religions or all religious institutions are selective in practice and entirely discriminatory. That's why the welfare that is linked to them is also discriminatory. That's the first thing we need to take down when we're going to prove to you that side negative is going to be the fair side in this debate. The first thing we're going to tell you is, assuming that's true, assuming that all religions are that discriminatory and that selective, what did we tell you in response? Even if that was true, then there are always alternatives that other people can go to. If I, as a Catholic, is discriminated by the religion of Islam, then I can go to other alternatives, or I can go to other religions who will be more accommodating, and vice versa applies. What we don't understand from them is this black and white context, saying to you that all religions are discriminatory, that religions aren't altruistic, even though they are when it comes to status quo. And that's why we give you the example. Even if the Catholic Church stands against HIV, stands against contraception, nearly half of the aid that Africa receives for HIV and AIDS protection comes from the Catholic Church. This is an example on how they're how they're factually untrue, but even if they are untrue, we're still better because there are alternatives that people can subscribe to. Sit down. But what are the other examples that we provided you that describe this? We gave you examples like NGOs that also selectively cater. For example, a worker union will cater to the rights of laborers at the expense of capitalist institutions. That's an example on how they're selective in their treatment, but we still allow that in status quo because people have a right to identify with a certain identity, and that's a religious identity when it comes to the nuance in this debate. I'll take you later. The other thing they told us was that, the state can provide the same benefits as the church. We told you that there was an exclusive benefit that only exists coming from our side, and that's the idea of spiritual wellness and the spiritual health that people receive. And this is something that we think is important. That's why we protect the right to religious freedom. But their main harm coming from our side is on the idea of proletizing people, because people will be brainwashed. Our problem with that argument is, where is the link? What is the link between the church's ability to brainwash people and them paying taxes? Because as a Catholic Church, sure, I'll continue my same practices, but I'll also be paying the same taxes. They haven't proven to us a mechanism to how the church will stop doing the same harmful practices that they say just because they're paying taxes. Where is the exclusive harm or benefit? Because that exists on your side. The only difference is, are they paying taxes or not? I'll take you later. The last thing, and the thing that they haven't responded to, is there's this idea that, like the church is against gay marriage or the church is against contraception. And they're trying to force us to defend the burden. Like they're trying to force us to defend, anti-homosexuality, or they're trying to defend us anti-contraception. Our burden on side negative is to prove to you the extent of religious freedom. And this is religious freedom. You allow them to believe in what they believe in their own confines, and you allow the state to believe in what they believe in their own confines. That's why in the US, we can respect religious freedom, but at the same time, the Supreme Court can pass gay marriage in all states. That's the exclusive benefit coming from our side. Please tell us why it can't be that way. Now let's go on to the first argument. I'll take you after this. How are you going to collapse the separation of church and state even more and make even greater disparity of balances? The harm that side affirmative is scared of is that the church is becoming too political and is shifting the balance in society. Which is ironic because it's their proposal that creates the same exact harm and policy. It's on their side where society becomes more backward thinking. I'll explain to you why. Because now, the church has an objective claim to make its demands to the government. What will the church do on their side? Okay, if I'm the Catholic Church, I'll go up to Parliament. I'll tell Parliament, this is how much I'm paying in taxes. I'm the Catholic Church. I demand that my demands be respected because I'm making an objective claim, because I have the data. I have the taxes to support my political benefit. The balance on our side exists like this. The church can't be political because they're not paying taxes. The church doesn't have a right to be political because they're not paying taxes. Your society is more backward thinking because now the church has a bigger right to intervene in politics. The church has a bigger right to intervene in how decisions are made. So it's on your side where the church is more justified with their backward thinking practices. That's why it's ironic. That's why your policy defeats itself, because you're creating a more politically active church with the weapons to support their cause when it comes to lobbying in politics. Your main harm was that, the church interferes with politics. politics. But that's exactly how you create that. You create that by giving the objective tools for churches to do that. And that's when they start paying taxes and they get the right to become a political institution in society. But before I go on, yes, sir.
So we proved the link of brainwashing, and you considered to it, you said churches are unique in spiritual wellness. And spiritual wellness is conditional on a religion. So if a person wants to continue to get better, doesn't it mean he needs to subscribe to that religion or subscribe to the system that church is propagating to his welfare?
If I want to be Catholic, I'll subscribe to the Catholic religion. But at that point where it doesn't work out for me and I want to change religions, I can perfectly do so. What we don't get from you is why you're telling people that it's a lifeline decision that they're forever tied to. If I don't want to be Catholic anymore, if I don't believe in the same things anymore, then it's easy for me to shift in to another alternative which will provide me the same benefits. And that's the problem and the premise that you continue to push to us. Now let's go on to the second argument on how you bastardize the right of individuals to practice their religion. The right to practice religion is one of the few rights that the state proactively protects because we realize it's an essential part of your individual's identity. What is the harm that comes into existence because of side affirmative? Individuals will feel victimized by the state intervention, and this will identify into other certain types of harms. For example, on the micro level, you're going to restrict the choices of religious individuals. How does this happen? For example, as a religious individual, I'm no longer incentivized, or I no longer want to donate to the church because I know my donations will just end up in the government's pockets and will fund the same programs I'm going to. They're making a false dichotomy. Their justification for taxing the churches because we can tax individuals who are against abortions to pay for abortion clinics. What is the difference between making individuals pay for taxes and making the church pay for taxes? The difference is that individual doesn't represent an entire structural belief system while the church does. For example, a pro-life person is still required to pay for taxes for war because he's an individual. But that logic can't be applied to a same institution because they represent a structural belief system which we have to respect. And that is the false dichotomy that they're trying to create coming from said opposition. And the implications are different. There's an implication from one person paying for a war, and there's an implication when the Catholic Church is actively paying for a war that they do not want to be part of. It's the extent of harm that they fail to realize and that they fail to respond to, which we think we have to get coming from their speakers. So why do we think we're breaking the deadlocks coming from our side? The first deadlock that we tried to break was this idea of whether the church is selective or not, which we've disproven to you by saying that even if that was true, there are a lot of other alternatives they can subscribe to, like other NGOs or another religion that they want to shift into. But secondly, their only justification for paying taxes against my own belief as individuals, and we've disproven to you that with the second argument. But the last thing that makes this debate go to side negative is the idea that they're making the church more politically active on their side because now they have a tangible and an objective claim to make political demands from their state because they're paying taxes, because they're paying for certain welfare programs. And this is where the church can play the hostage game. If I'm the Catholic Church, I'll just simply tell my state, I'll stop paying my taxes, I'll stop paying for your welfare reforms if you accept my demands. And that's where you get an unhealthy system for discourse and a dangerous system for social change. For all those reasons and more, we're proud that this motion should follow. Thank you.
After the two speeches of side opposition, they still have failed to prove and tell us why they are okay with being complicit in the brainwashing, the victimization of vulnerable people that depend on the state for food, for welfare, and for help. But the same expense comes with indoctrination, a force down the throat of values that you do not want to believe in, but you still have to because you are indebted to them, because you're dependent on them. We think that that in of itself is a failure inside opposition. But multiple more will come in my issues. There are two issues in today's debate. Number one, why this policy is principally justified. Why side government takes this issue? Because we tell you that it's principally violating the criteria in which we adjudicate and whether or not we accord tax exemptions. But second of all, why the state is much better in helping poor people and helping the welfare system become a better one. First of all, we told you that the church is conditional and discriminatory. And they told you that, hey, no, in African countries, that these churches don't do this because they don't ask you who you're Catholic or not. But in those circumstances, if I know that you are a homosexual, if I know that you are a prostitute, if I know that you went through abortion, I am less likely to treat you better when I'm coming to give you my aid and give you my food stamps or soup kitchens in those circumstances. But at the very best case scenario, that help comes at the expense of indoctrination and a force down of values
that you wouldn't have otherwise subjected to. So especially in areas where there's the same asymmetry of power, like Kishan told you, which is also not responded to, where missionaries go to rural areas where there are no other alternatives in which we can subscribe to, they are forced to bend down to the will of the church. They are forced to study and value that, because those are the organizations that are helping them. They are seen as the saviors. So we're against missionaries, we're against proselytizations, because these are victimizations of individuals who have otherwise not subscribed to these values. Then they told us, because we questioned them, what are the other alternatives that they're talking about in today's debate? Because the second speaker also told us the alternative, because he told us, if I was Catholic and I don't believe in the Catholic principles, I can just opt out of the system. This is flawed for a number of reasons. First of all, you can't just change from Islam to Catholic, because in those circumstances, both organizations do the exact same thing, where they force down values that are not subjected to you and not conditional and are not right to begin with. But second of all, in these kinds of environments or in these kinds of circumstances, obviously there's one predominant religion, so you're obviously still subjected to one asymmetry of power and asymmetry of influences. So it's not easy to opt out of it, especially when your characterization is that churches are the only ones that are providing for the poor and the state is not doing so. Second of all, the principle of taxation. They told us that some NGOs have specific motives and they are forced to people to do these things, and we still give them tax exemptions anyway. More of the bad thing doesn't mean that it's okay to constantly do it again and again and again. But we don't think so. There is no NGOs that force you to question your entire principle on life and question your values that you have as a person when you want to subscribe and donate to that NGO in the first place. We don't think those things exist. But then they told us there are certain NGOs that are prioritizing a particular cause over another cause. If we think that that's not discriminatory, that means that you're specializing into a particular cause as opposed to doing something else. Meaning, if these organizations are helping cancer patients by doing so, these organizations don't pick and choose whether you're a gay cancer patient or you're a straight cancer patient, but they give it to all. Just because they're in the cancer region doesn't mean they're discriminatory to other researchers that exist in sales score. We think they fail on that issue as well. Third question, because they kept on asking us, what is the link as to how our policy will help these individuals? Here's the link, Madam Chair. If these individuals are doing many bad things like indoctrination, the harmful ability to have gay marriage, and forcing individuals to subscribe to values that are harmful, the ability for them to do that is conditioned upon money. If we take away money and the ability to do that, that means there will be less missionaries, less proselytization, less of an ability for the church to go to other places and force values down your throat. And that is the link, guys. Respond to that link. Next, why is it fair? Because taxing means you're funding a war, and this is violation of the state principle. So Kishan already told you, first of all, that nobody cares about what you think about or what your principles are in today's debate. You are accorded to the state and you are subscribing to the values of the state. Meaning taxation isn't conditioned upon what you believe in, whether or not I want contraception or whether or not I want gay marriage. Taxation means you're a person and you subscribe to the values of the state. Second of all, he told us that, the church will now demand in parliament because I as a person have paid so much money. If that is true, any average Christian Catholic right wing will go to in the parliament and demand multiple things because he paid taxpayer money. And that doesn't happen. You just don't allow random individuals who pay tax money to go and demand certain demands because I am a person who has told you so many things and I have given you money, so you have no ability to do so. And we think that that's untrue in the first place. Then he told us that this is different because this is an organization that is subscribing to a value, an organization that's funding a war. Here's the difference. NGOs or like anti-vaccine organizations who still pay taxes still don't have a right to demand certain things in parliament because they pay taxes. So even if we still fund vaccines and we still make mandatory vaccination, we still don't let NGOs have an opposition to it, and we still force NGOs to pay taxes because they are subscribing to the values of the state. We think that that's untrue and unfair. Next. Do we help the poor, and which side of the house helps the poor? Because both sides agree that it's an important part of this debate, and whether the church should do it or the state should do it. But before that, sure.
Sir, even if the church has less money, said missionaries, the bigotry of the followers of the church aren't linked to money. They're linked to the belief systems of the church. So how are you changing that by making the church?
Yeah, I'll explain that my next issue. I promise you. The states can't feed the poor, and here's the reason why. Because we told you, and both sides agree, that the money that you spend on tax exemption is a lot, and tax exemption isn't as cheap as you think. Meaning, if these kinds of cash dollars are exposed back to the state, and the state has more of an ability to go and actually have neutral soup kitchens, neutral welfare systems in which you don't discriminate against an individual, I don't see why that's a better. So we have more money, and we're willing to trade it off. Next, is religious freedom an important part of this debate? If your religious freedom is hampering the right of an individual to stay true to his principles, your religious freedom is not absolute, and we can restrict that right to religion. We think that's unfair for you to just simply say that everybody has a right to religion and we cannot do this because they have a right to religion. If it harms people like it is doing right now at this particular point in time, we will not subscribe to those values. The next concern that they had was that The next concern that they had was that individuals were feeling angry, that Muslims and Catholics were very, very angry, and that is a problem in today's debate. First of all, the reason that they said that is because my money goes to the state, and my money is funding wars, and I don't want that to happen, so I'm less likely to donate. If these individuals are altruistic, as you characterize them to be, they will still donate in any circumstance as all, because that money is going to my God, that money is going to Jesus, because I love and I adore him as a person. But next, even if they get very, very angry, and even if these individuals get so pissed off, we do not care, because the out goal and the end goal is that maybe we have angry Catholics and angry Muslims in today's debate, but we have less and more neutral welfare system. We have more neutral ability. We have more efficient welfare systems, neutrality, and filling in the principles of helping poor people. But the last thing is we make the church less political, and here's why. If churches now can lobby so many things because they have so much money, we are fueling and we are making it complicit, because we are helping them lobby for more principles that we would never have worry about in status quo. So if we make the church less political, we think that that is the benefit that we were willing to stand for. At the very end of this way, Madam, we want a neutral welfare system, and you can never obtain the neutral welfare system via side opposition.
The government whip. Remind everybody to please whisper at the bench so I can hear. Thank you. And welcome to the opposition whip.
Madam Speaker, it's quite hard for me to believe the fundamental premise of side affirmative, of the state being such a neutral actor, when oftentimes it passes down policies that proliferate the tyranny of the majority. Just look at the context of this country. It's run by an imperialist Malaysian society that would always disenfranchise the interests of the minority. Before proceeding with the issues of the debate, construct the premises of affirmative. They think these premises are black and white or absolute. But that's never how the state adjudicates conflicting principles. They always work at a compromise. That's why the first fundamental premise that they argued wrongly was the idea that you have to limit the influence of the church. We think this premise is fundamentally flawed because it assumes that the church won't react, when likely that's where the church has the impetus to use and demonize the state for you no longer having access to the things you used to. And when they make you vulnerable, it's more likely for you to further adhere to the church when you no longer have access to those certain things you used to. Sit down. But second mistake they have is to proliferate this premise that assumes that the state is a neutral actor, when no, it is likely for the state to always proliferate the tyranny of the majority at the expense of the minority. But the marginal benefit we have is that the church can extend its social services to far-off places when it comes to things such as moral solace and other things like that. Sit down. But their last premise that we ought to take down is this idea that the state ought to be neutral. So the trade-off is for your freedom to religion. We think passing the buck on the state by doing its job by impeding the ability of the churches to function is fundamentally retarded. We allow selective help all the time, and I'm going to later explain to you why their delineation isn't sufficient. Two questions to show you why Ateneo 1 is taking this debate. Sit down. The first question is, does the church deserve to be tax exempt? The biggest issue we have under this idea is that their premise of the church making aid selective. We were quick as early on as first speaker to tell you that these biases when it comes to helping out people are perfectly fine when we talk about things such as NGOs. The response they give to this was this idea that there is a delineation. NGOs help out a sector. Madam Speaker, we don't think that delineation is sufficient because by using their own language against them, I'm helping out a sector of Catholics, I'm helping out a sector of Muslims, and whatever. Sit down. We tell you it's perfectly legitimate because there are non-government organizations who help homosexual teenagers exclusively. We think selective helping is exercising your duty to those who accept religious beliefs, and primarily that isn't the only source of help because you have other institutions and other charities too. But secondly, even if you tell them it isn't that easy to opt out, you are creating a false dichotomy that stipulates that the only way for you to help out is if you opt out of that religion. But in the greater majority of cases, it becomes harder for you not to believe that religion once you allow the church to use the narrative that the state is screwing us over. Sit down. That's why when they told you that you have to limit the ability of the church to proliferate discrimination when it comes to their believers, the idea that churches use welfare, we don't think it's a fair premise for them to argue. Sit down. When the church can no longer give you the things it used to, it becomes easier for churches to skew the narrative and blame it on the state. So it becomes easier for them to demonize these people and further not listen to their beliefs. Sit down. But secondly, even when it comes to things like blocking abortion and other social goods such as that, you inherently legitimize the church and encourage them into being politically active because they feel they have a stake. So that's why we think it's going to be harmful. But secondly, we tell you when the church does actions like these, it doesn't even impede these social goods from being forwarded. That's why even if in the US, religious institutions are tax exempted, gay marriage was perfectly legitimized after this issue. That's why when we told you that it collapses the separation of the church and state, it was fairly unstrategic for them to give us the response that there becomes this condition to shift out of a religion. To which we say it's an over-exaggeration. When they do things like proselytize and post calamities, they have trained psychologists that would talk to you regardless of what your religious beliefs are. It's about helping you through that trauma, and we think those are the kinds of institutions that you are crippling. Sit down. But secondly, we don't think it's very strategic for them because it becomes easier for the state to demonize them. But moreover, people's bigotry isn't linked to their money, but based on the beliefs of the church. Before the second issue, go.
Can you name an NGO that you tax exempt that decides and selectively discriminates individuals based on race, sexuality, or any characteristics because they are selective?
Something called the Visayan Forum, who automatically helps those who are human trafficked. They pick the sector in exchange of other sectors because they do think when it comes to helping these people, this is the perfect way for them to do so. So we think on balance, the church does deserve to reach tax exemption. Second question I'd then like to ask is this particular idea of what are the consequences for this policy on how particularly religions act. What we told you coming from our first speaker that they never really adequately responded to was the idea that you violate religious freedom. Their response was that it's a lie. But we do tell you that there is a difference between individuals and institutions. On an individual level, you violate the belief of one individual. But when it comes to an institution, you violate an entire belief system that extends far beyond out of your country. No, thank you. But we tell you secondly, even if religious institutions will incur that damage, it becomes easier for them to impose upon their beliefs, irregardless if you tax exempt them. So it shows you that the change they're trying to achieve under their side is largely tokenistic because of the inadequate links they've been giving to us. Lastly, when we told you that religion should be tax exempted because they forward social goods far beyond the state, their response that this isn't necessarily a good thing because you impede their ability to be neutral actions didn't really hit the argument. Because the argument was talking about values such as proselytizing and you actively helping out of people out of trauma, which we already told you wasn't conditional. We say that their side encourages churches to be more bigots when it allows you to use the narrative that the state is demonizing you. So you're gonna empower people from being further bigoted. That's why the last thing I want to talk about is this idea coming from them that the state becomes fundamentally complicit in encouraging the things the state does. To which we say, it's unrealistic for them to say that just because we tax exempt an institution, we automatically adhere to their beliefs. That's why we told you, coming from the US's example, the gay marriage idea was still passed, even though the Catholic Church and other institutions that are against it are tax exempt. So why do we win this debate? We've proven to you that a lot of their premises needed to be questioned. We showed you that their links weren't sufficient enough when it comes to pushing their harm. For the reason of being the more team that worked on idea of compromise, we take this debate. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank the oppositional speaker and also the opposition reply speaker.
In this debate, both sides were aiming to reach the same goal, to create a more respectful, to create a more dynamic society in which social institutions can coexist properly. For me to prove to you that side negative on this debate, we need to look at the fundamental premises that they launched and how those fundamental premises don't mix with the logical and the sound conclusions that they're trying to push for. The first thing that they hammered to us coming from both constructive speakers was the idea that religious institutions selectively function when it comes to welfare and aid. We disproved this by giving you 3 types of responses. First, we told you this was factually untrue by giving the matter. For example, in Africa, the Catholic Church comprises nearly half of all the aid that victims receive, even if they're against contraception. That was a factual disimprovement. But secondly, we told you the even if response, that even if that was true, if I feel that I'm truly being victimized by, and I can't, that I'm truly being victimized by my sect, then I will always have alternatives and I will always have other religions to subscribe to. But thirdly, we took it even a step further by telling you that even the state isn't the most benevolent actor, because they still have their own like biases, like a race-based bias or religion-based bias when it comes to the tyranny of certain majorities. So we were able to disprove that by telling you that one, that state isn't always benevolent, but by two, that there are always other alternatives and there is no urgency to your policy. The second fundamental premise that they all shared was the idea that if you take away money from the church, it gets weaker because, you know, they get less missionaries, but, you know, because they have less lobbying money. How did we disprove this? The first way we disproved it is that the bigotry of their followers isn't linked to the money. The bigotry of their followers is linked to the beliefs that the church system has. So we kept asking for the link. Why will they change their beliefs? Why will they have another Vatican Council just because you're taxing them? Why will they have these certain necessary changes if that certain belief system isn't even linked to the money? Sure, the church will have less missionaries, but the followers won't be effective because they're still believing in the same Bible verses because those haven't been changed. But we took it even a step further. We told you that it's on their side will the church lobbies more and the church becomes more politically insidious. Why? Because now the church is an active and political claim because they're paying for taxes, which means they can be objective in parliament, which means they can make certain political demands because they are the largest tax-paying institution in that state. So that's how we took down the second fundamental premise, and that's how that goal doesn't reach their goal for better society. The third fundamental premise we took down is that they told us that we need to curb the ability of religions to spread their beliefs. First of all of their arguments is basically arguing the right of any institution to have religious freedom. Because we asked the question, is it the responsibility of the state to prohibit religions from spreading their beliefs? We told you that no, that's why you have the right to religious freedom, because people have right to identify with a certain identity. But they tried to burden push us to defend anti-homosexuality or defend anti-contraception. That's not the extent of religious freedom. We told you that the extent of religious freedom believes that you can believe in what you believe, but in your own confines, and the state can have its same principles in its own confines. That's why you gave the examples like the US, in which we can legalize same-sex marriage, but that also have religious institutions be tax exempt. But lastly, the fourth fundamental premise that we tried to debunk and we successfully debunked is the idea that we already forced individuals, for example, who are against divorce to pay for divorce, to pay for divorce law firms, for example, and that we should extend it to the church. How did we reply to this strategically? We talked about implications. There is a different implication from individual A paying for war and the Catholic Church paying for war. Individual A will just lose his money, but the Catholic Church will look like the most Hippocratic body in the world and they would lose all of its support. And those are the implications. If you look at it, this debate had benefits and harms comparison. In their best case scenario is that the church will lose a lot of money and that believers will feel victimized. Why is it a horrible best case scenario? It's a horrible best case to achieve their goal. They never responded to our idea that the church becomes more objectively political or that they're bastardizing their individuals' rights to have a certain identity. And that's why we think we were able to successfully shift those deadlocks to side negative, and we were able to debate this motion in a fairer context. And that's why we think we should win this round. We are glad to oppose.
If a person lives in a state where churches operate the most effective welfare systems as characterized by side opposition, where they have the deepest reaches into rural areas where people have a lesser amount of information, we think that this is the system in which side opposition and the reality that they constructed, which ultimately led to their downfall. Following this logic, individuals don't have a choice, don't have an ability to opt to another welfare system, and don't have an ability to construct a reality in which they aren't subliminally fed messages that challenge their own perceptions. We would prefer a state that might be biased, that might prefer racial majorities, that might sideline racial minorities. But at the end of the day, is that states are accountable to their people. And states want people to be financially stable, because welfare is about giving everyone financial stability. So states need people to be financially stable, regardless of whether you're Indian, you're Chinese, or you're Malay. As much as biased as they are, they need people to be financially stable for a state to operate. It wasn't enough for them to say they questioned our premises. It wasn't enough for them to say that we didn't draw links, because they didn't have a conclusive outcome. We did have one. Our outcome was that if they are not doing a public good, if they are restricting the ability for other individuals to exercise a public good, then that warrants a removal of your ability to continue those things. Mr. Speaker, they didn't challenge our premises, they didn't challenge our outcomes. 2 questions: whether it's fair to award them this tax exemption, right? And secondly, what are the outcomes that churches will resolve into, and why are we willing to trade that off? 1, whether it's fair. They say they cater to a sector of Christians, the same way cancer charities cater to individuals in cancer. There is a difference, Madam Chair, because when you pick a sector, it is not a crime by virtue of helping people, it's a crime of omission. You choose to help people in welfare. You don't choose to help Christians, you choose to help a welfare system. And it's a crime of omission when you reject welfare, and they conceded to this throughout their bench after a while, when you reject welfare to racial minorities and individuals based on their choices. So logic, guys, there was bad construction there. Secondly, they said individuals feel victimized. Individuals will always feel victimized when people progress, when people liberalize, and there's an infringement on your religious right. Because there's a direct correlation between religious suppression and liberal progression. Because at the end of the day, people need to feel suppressed if homosexuals want to get married. It's an infringement on your belief because the state is acting upon their own decision. Then they said churches are unique and they provide spiritual wellness, and this ultimately led to their downfall, because the unique aspect of a church when it comes to welfare is the uniqueness that we don't want in welfare. Spiritual wellness is conditional upon a religion that you need to subscribe to. That means the element of welfare that you want to indoctrinate within people, which is spiritual wellness, would require people to subscribe to a religion. Meaning it's not enough for them to say, oh, if I don't like Christianity, I can opt out of this welfare, because the welfare is based upon Christianity. It's based upon you accepting spiritual wellness based upon your characterization. But secondly, what will the churches do? They said bigotry. They said redirecting your funds towards executing policies. We say we don't care. As much as churches already do this when it comes to gay marriage being legal in the United States, we can minimize these harms. But money equals power. And the amount of money that a church has is more money to redirect policies, to change legislature, and to shape the minds of the people. So it's a scale. Under our paradigm, they have lesser money to shape the minds of the people. Under your paradigm, they have more money and the same bigoted perceptions, and they will continue to make conservative policies under that paradigm. They never answered why they were willing to make this trade-off. But then they said they have demands in parliament. We don't accept this in status quo. We don't see how it will be better under your paradigm. They haven't proven the structural link there. And lastly, they said it's an imprisonment of a person's religious freedom. We don't give people tax exemptions because of their religious freedom. We give you tax exemptions insofar as you help an innocent soul. So don't get it wrong. You only get more money if you help more people. It's not based on your religious freedom. It's based on your ability to help other individuals on the ground.
Okay, thanks everyone. Step outside, please.